So as many of you know, and I think it seems appreciate, that the focus of the talks is on something very specific, and that's happiness for the human being. And it approaches the topic from a practical daily living point of view, which means we can talk more or less in terms of dynamics that we're familiar with and can have direct contact with, and in words that are not too esoteric. And so that's one of the reasons why it's said that the seeking is about happiness. Sometimes we wouldn't use a word like that. For example, we would say seeking is about knowing your true self. Now, which is correct? Is it about happiness, or is it about knowing the true self? Or instead of the true self, it might be truth, could be the word that's used. Or instead of truth, it could be, it's about knowing that which is formless, not a thing, that which can't be spoken of or described. So the seeking is about happiness, or the seeking is about knowing that which is indescribable. The seeking is a seeking for truth. Now, they're not really in opposition with each other. They're just looking at the whole and saying, oh, well, we can describe it from this angle, and from this angle, it's about truth. From this angle, it's about your true self. And from this angle, it's about happiness, which is described as peace of mind. And so is it that they're incompatible with each other, or can we see that they're all interlinked and maybe all aspects of the same thing? So one of the concepts in the teaching is that coming to realize that we are not the doer leads to unbroken connection to source. And it is that unbroken connection to source that delivers unbroken peace of mind, which turns out to be what is described here as happiness for the human being, the happiness in the form of unbroken peace of mind, which comes from the recognition of an unbroken connection to source. And maybe our unbroken connection to source is what we can call our true self, because unbroken connection, even though the words imply two, can just be language talking about a recognition of an aspect of ourself that is obviously not separate from ourself. If we say it's an aspect of ourself, it can't be separate from us. And so the recognition of our unbroken connection to source may actually be referring to a recognition of a deeper aspect of ourself. And that deeper aspect of ourself might be what is referred to as our true nature, as opposed to the aspects of ourself that keep us disconnected from that. So if there's an aspect of ourself that keeps one part of ourself covered up, we could call that not our true nature. And that may just be a way of contrasting the two. So there is merit in explaining how we can look at these things from different angles, and in fact, they're not really that separate. So the part of this teaching that emphasizes our true nature is, or one way that our true nature is referred to is drop into being, which really means dropping out of thinking into the present moment, where not only are we aware of what's happening in the present moment and maybe see the flowers and basically come into dropping out of thinking, means dropping out of the thinking about the past and the future and all of the doership and attachment thinking that we have, and drop into the present. And suddenly, in a moment, in an instant, it's like the curtains are opened up. And if we describe it like that, we might think, oh my goodness, the curtains are open. What are we going to find behind the curtains? The curtains are a representation of the thinking mind subsiding. Or the curtains maybe opening up is not so, maybe they just fall is a better imagery. And so the curtains basically all the resistance to what has happened in the past, what's happening in the future, resistance that says, this has to have a certain outcome, otherwise it's a problem about who I am, worrying in the future. And if we drop into being, which is not something we can just do, I guess there has to be a movement that starts to strengthen that pathway to being. And at some point we find, dropping into being is like wiggling our ears. This is I should have it actually, one day I'll read it. There's a poem that someone has written about, please tell me how to wiggle my ears. And they wrote this poem in relation to listening to the pointers. And so sometimes the pointers say, drop into being, drop out of the thinking mind. And it's all very easy when that muscle has been strengthened, and it's, all right, of course, I am can be the thought that arises that drops us out of thinking into being. And yet, if that movement hasn't revealed itself, hasn't strengthened itself, it can be like, just drop out of thinking. It's so simple, just effortless, drop in. And yet it can be very much like someone trying to wiggle their ears when that's not something that the physiology has wired itself to be able to do. And for someone who can wiggle their ears, and you say, can you tell me how to wiggle your ears? And well, you just, wiggle your ears. It seems so obvious. And yet it can be very frustrating to someone who's trying to wiggle their ears, and it's like the wirings are connected. So drop into being is something that hopefully we find happening as we hear about dropping out of thinking, becoming aware of the present moment, and using the movement of becoming aware of what's here now as part and parcel of dropping out of thinking into beingness. And where that maybe starts to become something that happens is as we start to realize that the thinking mind, guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And so you need to see which of those you are most familiar with. Which one of those can you recognize? So there could be all of those happening from time to time, but you might not recognize some of them as being that. There might be one, let's say your tendency to blame the other. That might be something that you go, okay, blame, I can see that habit. And it's described as a disturbance of your peace of mind. And you can check that out and see if when blame is happening, you can say, I'm not happy. In that moment, I'm not happy. I'm blaming the other, and that blame is I can just feel it. It doesn't have to be a concept saying, oh, because I'm blaming, I'm not happy. I'm saying feel that in that moment, you can say, I'm not at peace with life. And that not at peace is a resistance, and it's an uncomfortableness. So to the extent that you become familiar with the fact that when that attitude towards the other, towards outcomes or circumstance kicks in, that is your unhappiness. And it starts off by simply being aware, oh, that is my uncomfortableness, that is my unhappiness, and that it has happened, and it's an attitude to how the other behaved. And it's an attitude of saying they are the doer, they could have acted differently. And furthermore, that the way they acted that delivered pain to me is an attack on my happiness. So at first, it's just a becoming familiar that every time that attitude kicks in, it's like a metaphor, for example, turning on the hose and spraying water out of the hose into the environment. And let's say the water is stinky, stagnant water. And at first you didn't realize that every time you turn on the hose and spray it around, that you're spraying around stinky, stagnant water. So you keep doing it, thinking this is good for the environment that I'm in. This is, some sort of benefit. Simply because maybe we were told it's a benefit or whatever. We just assume. We never really checked. And it could be that it's stinky, stagnant water, and our concept that it is beneficial has prevented the recognition that actually this is stinky, stagnant water. And so a friend comes around one day and sees you every now and again getting this hose and spraying around stinky, stagnant water all over them and all over you. And they say, what are you doing? And go, oh, I'm just adding value to my life. Spraying this stuff. And they said, what do you mean you're adding value? It's stinky and it's making me wet, and you stop it. You go, what do you mean? And they say, well, go and smell the water, and you don't need to get wet. You're perfectly fine dry. In fact, it's good to be dry. You've just had your hair done and it's all been blow dried and everything. And here you are spraying stinky, stagnant water that's making your hair go flat, and it's all smelly, and it's ruining the tableware and all this stuff out here. And you start realizing, oh, look at that. Maybe you're onto something. I've been doing this my whole life, spraying this, what I thought was adding value to my life. So the instruction isn't really for you to originally stop spraying the water, because you've been doing it because you're convinced that it is adding value. And so to expect for that to just stop is unreasonable, because it's who you are. So at first, it's just about recognizing, testing, confirming for yourself that this water that you think is adding value in your life is actually is doing things to your hair, let's say, is ruining the tableware or the artwork on the walls or whatever. So you've got to tick all these things off, tick, 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 tick. And no question about stopping doing it at this point. It's just about becoming aware. And so once you're aware that it's no good for things, you've confirmed it for yourself based on your own investigation, then that might turn into a movement which is an automatic movement, not you as a doer, an attitude saying, oh, I have to stop, but automatically when the hose comes out, something might come in, oh no, this isn't so good after all. And the hose might get put down for a second or two, and then suddenly the hose comes out again, and you're spraying around, and the thought comes out, no, look, there you go again. The hose comes down. And as the awareness of what's going on without an insistence on it changing, as there's awareness, the change may happen. It's how the change happens most effectively when the doer doesn't come in and say, as of this moment, no more hose spraying. It seems like that doer that thinks it can suddenly miraculously change the world doesn't have a great effect on real ingrained change happening. And in time, we might find that the stopping is something that just happens midway, where there's a remembering, oh, just in this present moment, no need for that thinking. It's just thinking. I can go back to that thinking in some minutes. So the stopping is just a rolling back out of the process of thinking. If we bring thinking in to try and stop the thinking, it's not really this dropping out. It's like almost like the imagery I just get is a bit like fainting. You know, when you faint, you drop out of the activity. And so this is like a fainting of your thinking mind, where the thinking mind just without a fainting of losing total consciousness. So you're still fainting. I don't know why these metaphors come up that are ironically inappropriate. So it doesn't mean fainting where you lose consciousness of the present moment, but it's like as if your thinking mind faints, which is what leaves us here in the present. Oh, how nice. My thinking mind fainted for a moment. That's peace of mind. Peace of mind is the absence of the thinking mind. And you can't march the thinking mind out, because that would be more thinking mind. The thinking mind just starts being, having the power pulled out from it. So talking about how to describe things from different points of view, truth. I did mention that truth is could be related to our true nature, and true nature could be this aspect of the human being which we can call beingness that we may have forgotten about, and that the thinking mind is our false nature, the idea of who I am, that within the idea is convinced that happiness is to be found in outcomes in the future, that pleasure is an addition to my completeness, and pain is a subtraction of my completeness, and that I have to make life happen. I'm the one that has to drive the train, and maybe it's a bit like, not realizing that you're on the train and it's taking you and you're there. I think one of the examples or metaphors used is you're on the train and you're holding your luggage, heavy luggage up, and someone says, you can put it down and it will get to where you're going. You don't have to keep carrying the luggage. And you don't need to worry about driving the train either. So this idea of who we are is a bit like the one thinking I need to drive the train, or I am driving the train by focusing on where we're going, and I have to hold the luggage, which are two false ideas. So that thinking mind could be the false self, and the truth might be resting outside of the thinking mind. Now, often, in order for a resting outside of the thinking mind, there is a focus on awareness or beingness. And we might then understandably think that truth is something very specific, that truth is something almost, in a way, something, but not something we can think about. But nonetheless, we're still looking for truth and thinking one day truth is going to hit me. So I'd like to talk about truth differently, because when I hear the descriptions put forward of truth as, being described as awareness or the absolute or the absence of thinking of good or bad, that's very valid. That is a way of describing what is true. But there's another way of pointing to it. What does truth look like in practical terms? If someone is looking for truth, and truth equates to peace of mind, or rather they're interconnected. If I hear someone talking about truth not as the outcome or not as the manifestation of truth, but looking for, let's say, your true nature. Now, remember, it's being connected to your true nature that allows peace of mind to arise, allows the thinking mind to subside. And in practical terms, we needn't really talk about our true nature. We can talk about peace of mind or the absence of suffering. So how can we talk about truth other than pointing at the true self? Is the true self what we have to be solely focused on? And I think we can talk about truth as being a movement in daily life. What is truth in daily life? And I would say that truth in daily life is a non-engagement in things that we ordinarily would get engaged in. That the engagement is non-truth. The engagement is non-truth, and truth is essentially a moving away, a pulling out of, a dissolving of the engagement. Now, engagement doesn't mean not participating in life. It doesn't mean not going to the shops and saying hi to the shopkeeper and all of this. But there is a non-engagement, a certain non-engagement, which is a non-engagement in non-truth, right? So a non-engagement in non-truth, which means stop lying, let's say, if we use the word lying to represent non-truth, or false, stop the false, stop the lying. So stop the non-truth, which means non-engagement in non-truth. And if there is non-engagement in non-truth, then it's truth. Then what you're left with is truth. So what is the engagement in non-truth? Because we may not realize the engagement in non-truth that's happening. And the engagement in non-truth is usually got to do with defending. That's one very big example or manifestation of non-truth, is to feel attacked and to defend. And that defending and feeling attacked and hence defending or attacking back is engagement. So I'll use an example. I was having a chat with someone about what was it about? About children, having children. And I wondered, I said, are you interested in having children? And she, no, not particularly. But her mother, on the other hand, has a perspective about children and what value they add into life. And the example was that from the mother's point of view, it could be that not having children is because of a certain negative structure, let's say. And so if someone were to tell someone else that this is the case, if you don't want to have children, it's because of a failing in a way. It's because something hasn't quite worked itself out. Now, if you happen to be the person who doesn't really want to have children, or that you just find that you're not inclined that way, and then someone says, my view is that if someone doesn't want to have children, it's because they haven't worked X, Y, and Z out. Now, that could be received as quite a strong criticism. It could be received as you're not quite right, because if you were quite right, you would want to have children. And that, if that was heard, would potentially cause either someone going into shame or someone going into blame and defending and say, hey, I don't think that you've got that right. From my point of view, and so we feel compelled to defend ourselves against essentially a concept that someone has about this topic. And the defense or the engagement in that conversation is essentially a form of uncomfortableness. It's not necessarily, we can easily have a conversation about something like this. However, what I'm talking about is when the conversation includes a certain penetration down to the level of self. And if the conversation has that penetration down to the level of self, then essentially it's become a form of doership and attachment to outcome. And so our engagement in what is going on in life, what someone else says to us, is our non-truth, if that engagement takes up a certain characteristic. And we might not realize that when we go through the day, through life, there are certain interactions coming in that are received in a certain way, and our engagement in the circumstance is essentially the non-truth. And if the person finds themselves really with no doubt about their position, and clear that this is actually a movement that is not just a belief of the doer, they feel connected. Someone can have these perspectives, and there isn't a buying in by the person into a defending and an arguing, because essentially they're not holding a concept about themselves. And so the concept from the other that essentially is saying, in a passive way, you're not quite good enough, is received as simply a concept. And if we realize that you are unlikely to even be able to have a conversation about it without them digging, their heels in the ground about their opinion, and that if that becomes the case, then a harmony falls away, you naturally will just want to move in the other direction. Not, I hate them, but like a lack of interest in talking about certain subjects that you know are essentially the psychological me position for you or for the other person. And so when our structure changes such that the doership and attachment to outcome has fallen away, attachment to outcome really means that we believe that our sense of self is added to by pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Now, so if someone thinks that we're not quite right, that's pain. And if we think that our sense of self is dependent on the other seeing us as right, then we can't let that be. We can't just walk away from it, because we'll be sort of walking away from something that is out of line with our completeness. So we feel compelled to try and rectify it. And then when we try and rectify it, which means try to convince the other person otherwise, that's when likely in life that you get into an argument. They put their position forward even more strongly. You feel more attacked. You try to change their view. And that's the disharmony between two people, where essentially one person is saying to the other, you need to be different. And as that attachment to outcomes falls away, primarily because of a connection to oneself, which means having dropped out of thinking often enough and found that my happiness is to be found in the present moment by simply dropping out of these narratives, then there is a real reason and motivation to just move away. Now, move away doesn't necessarily mean physically getting up out of the room and moving away. It just means finding ways, knowing ways of not responding in a way that is not even offensive. Your whole point is not to be offensive because this person has this idea about you. It's even completely the opposite. It's recognizing they just have an opinion which they're entitled to, and that their opinion isn't an attack actually on who you really are. And so it's just almost like a sensibility that you know not to talk about religion and politics and various sports. And there's just this intelligence that it's not, if you get a sense that you're not going to meet eye to eye, then you go, oh, let me move towards truth, which really move towards truth means let me not get engaged in that defense of the psychological me. Another example might be where you yourself, without needing someone else to be in the room, go off into a certain type of thinking about life. And if you realize that is, let's say, starting to think about the future, and maybe you see there's a tendency to imagine negative outcomes that actually don't tend to turn out, but you find yourself tending to look on the negative side of things, and then you imagine that outcome and you start to get more stressed, that may be seen, oh, that's moving and engaging in non-truth. So what is truth in practical terms? It's, let me move away from that. move away from non-truth. And why is it non-truth? It's non-truth because it's an engagement in circumstance, or an engagement and an attitude to life that is an attitude of the psychological me that believes its happiness is to be found in outcomes and believes it needs to do something about creating its happiness. And just dropping out, the thinking mind fainting and just leaving us free of the thinking mind. It's like, oh, this layer, this whole lens that is part of our internal landscape can just keep clearing away. And what we might realize is that when our structure, meaning our belief systems, the idea of who we are, the doership and attachment to outcome, was in place, we would always, wherever we went, we're engaging in non-truth. It's like the non-truth parts, like let's say there's poles in a field, and there's poles, stakes in the ground, and the stakes represent non-truth. It's like we're dragged to them. It's like they cotton candy. That's what we want. We move towards it. Because we don't understand, in a way, we think this is good for me. A bit like spraying, the metaphor of spraying that water is we go there, we're drawn there. It's because of the psychological me that's in place is drawn to those interactions. It actually is, in a way, it's a sense of feeling more alive. It's a sense of having an identity, and so it feels like feeding myself. It's actually feeding the false sense of self. So we're always drawn throughout the day to these interactions. So we might think that, if I had to move away from non-truth, I'd be spending my whole day dodging interactions because there's just so many of them. It's like, and it can almost sound like, I'd be just trying to avoid life. How could that be possible? It'd be like being on the run from people trying to, and you have to keep moving away. And the truth is that as that starts to happen, as we start to be less interested in that, what tends to happen is that the playing field seems to end up with fewer and fewer stakes in it, fewer and fewer stakes of non-truth. Now, that's not because the non-truths that used to be there aren't there anymore, but what it represents is that life is quite big. And it's like finding, not inviting those stakes into your field. Whereas when we're structured a certain way, we're inviting them in. And when we look around and we see all these stakes of non-truth in the ground, we think, I can't go anywhere in life and not have truth, not have these non-truths around. And I've got a metaphor in my head, is like, if you find a patch 1 meter square in this field, what can happen in terms of your life is you can expand that. It's like expanding that 100 times. So it then becomes 100 meters by 100 meters. And all the stakes are outside of that 100 meters by 100 meters. So you found that 1 meter square patch in your field where there's no stakes, But then you look around and there's stakes all around you, and you think, okay, as soon as I'm going to move from here, I'm going to be engaged in non-truth. However, what actually can happen in our life as we become less and less, it's almost like expanding that 1 meter by 1 meter to 100 meters. And then all the stakes are outside, and you've got 100 meters square, which is a lot of space to move around and not bump into any non-truth. And if occasionally a non-truth stake is making its way through your 100 meters by 100 meters, and you're not quite sure it's a non-truth stake, and you find yourself bumping in and saying, and then there's an interaction, and you feel, oh, here's the non-truth response coming up, and you go, let's go back to truth. And you say, oh, is this the time? Got to go. Enjoy your day. And you walk back to your other 80 meters of your 100, and you find there's no more of those stakes. And so you can spend another day or two with none of these interactions, the non-truth interactions. So, and that changes, your environment changes depending on how your internal structure changes. So it's about what you're drawn to. And so you can't expect to find yourself in this 100 meters by 100 meters relatively free of non-truth stakes if your structure is such that it's completely drawn to non-truth. If that's the case, there will be all these non-truth stakes around you, because you're going to be continually inviting them in and saying, oh, I'd like you to be quite close in case I need you, and you there close. And we don't realize what's going on. And structures, we're sort of saying, let's have a bit more space. So we stretch that non-stake, the non-truth stake space out so that there's more space, and it gets bigger and bigger. And then at some point, and a lot of this is, you're turning off television, you're not calling certain friends, you're not interested in elections, you're not interested in coronavirus. And so all of this is getting turned off. And remember, those were the things that you noticed. Oh, when I get engaged in the discussion about elections and politics, there's this dragging into non-truth. And so you become less and less interested, and then you find, how simple life can be when I'm not being dragged into non-truth. So there needs to be a realization of what that movement is. Anyhow, that was a little abstract. Let's see if we've got some questions for today. Hi, Isabel.
Hello, Roger. Nice to see you.
Yes, good to have you.
I have a question which is not maybe about truth, but for something you said the other day. And it's you said, if I am aware of something, I am not this thing. Did you say that, or?
I did, but actually I said that that's a teaching concept, and in fact it's not absolutely true, but it has its validity. But I wouldn't say it's absolutely truth.
It's it's always about my thinking about oneness, which doesn't disturb my current life and takes off a happy way of being. It's always there. But then I just thought maybe I was wrong, or I did not know really what even I meant about oneness, and that arises because of this sentence. Because if you say this, so you understand, I was a little confused about all this. What is oneness? And if this thing is not, if I am aware I'm not this thing, there's something I don't understand, really. I don't know if I'm clear.
Okay, so the pointer usually is that it says, be aware of the moment, be aware of your thoughts, be aware of your feelings, be aware of the body, be aware of this or that. It's the process of neti, not this, not that. And so it's part of self-inquiry. And the self-inquiry says that which you are aware of, that which you can observe, that which you can see, and can't be what you are, because what you are is that which is doing the awaring, that which is doing the seeing. And so that is a inquiry or a methodology that is part of the movement of disidentification from objects that are not what you are. Now that's a inquiry into awareness, really. So the body, you can be aware of the body, and so on the lines of this inquiry, you are not the body. You are that which is aware of the body. What is it that is aware of the body? What is it that is aware of the sound? What is it that is aware of the thoughts and the emotions?
That's conscience that would be aware.
Yeah, but so this inquiry is an inquiry that you aren't to do with your thinking. It's an inquiry to do in presence. So it's like, while being aware of the book, it's like, oh, if you can be aware of the book, you are not the book.
But in any case, I'm not.
It's something that you have to, do the inquiry, not as a concept, but in the present moment. Like, almost like, okay, pick up the red cup. So it's not about imagining picking up the red cup, it's about picking up the red cup, pick up the yellow cup. So when I ask what is aware of the body, you can't really give me the answer.
No, I can't.
No.
And you?
No, no one can.
No one can.
No, because as soon as you give the answer, you've just given a concept, right? The whole point of the exercise is to be that which is aware. To be that which you are, which is aware of the body, which you are not.
Okay.
We keep going around saying, like, doing these exercises as the body thinking about, oh, I, the body, am doing the exercise. And so it's like really the dog chasing its tail. Because the body is doing the exercise, and the exercise is saying, that which is aware of all of the objects is not what you are. So it's a it's an exercise that either will take us nowhere, because the one doing the exercise is actually the object, or there is such identification with the body object that, or it reveals something in the exercise, because something clicks. Oh, I am that which is aware. But it's not a thought, because that which is aware doesn't have thoughts. So it's like, really just be.
That's something I can reach when I meditate. Then I'm not thinking anymore. That's, but then that leads me to the question of oneness. What is it? Because I think maybe I'm seeking for something. I misunderstand things. I just realized that hearing you the other day. So okay, what are you seeking? What's the purpose?
I thought you realized it about 4 weeks ago when we spoke.
Sorry?
I said, it seemed like you realized it about 4 weeks ago when we spoke.
I know, I know. It's. I don't know.
Who cares about oneness?
I know. Who cares about oneness? I don't know why this keeps coming up. I don't know. That's why I
What are you really looking for?
maybe the idea I have of being oneness is maybe not make any difference between you and me, for example, or except you're Roger and I'm Isabel, or with anything about the universe, the non-duality, something that is not separate. That's for me being one, not having always someone or something in front of me. Maybe something that I don't know why it's.
Yeah, but remember, so I keep saying, I don't know, every day, what we're really looking for is peace of mind in daily living.
But I have that.
Yeah, I know. So why are you looking for oneness?
I don't know. It really keeps coming as it was a goal, and I like really life as it happens, and when I sometimes could forget about that, then I just drop on your teachings, and then I say, okay, here you are, and then there is always this coming. I don't know.
Recognize when you are seeking oneness and the seeking gets quite intense. Just notice that is a disturbance of peace of mind because it is expectation. And so it might be your good fortune to start getting frustrated about seeking oneness and realize that when you seek oneness, you lose peace of mind. And then you might realize, oh, my seeking for oneness is disturbing what I'm really looking for, which is peace of mind. So then it might be, I should stop seeking oneness. Then I'll get my peace of mind.
So maybe I just listen to you and not seek anything.
No, but if you have peace of mind, you don't even listen to me.
But I like listening to you.
Oh, okay. In that case, it's okay. But when you're listening to me, remember, I'm never talking about oneness.
Yes. Okay. I'll figure that then, maybe more. Anyway.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Oneness might be the thing to seek. Just be aware if seeking oneness interferes with peace of mind, and then see if it's worthwhile.
Okay, it's just always having. Maybe I don't have to make a move. Maybe it's. I don't know why it's always coming. It's.
So quickly before I leave, I'll talk about oneness in at least 2 different forms that are available, maybe 3. There can be a state of oneness. A state of oneness is where the awareness that is functioning in this moment presents itself in a way where this moment is clearly all made of awareness and contained within awareness. And what is aware of that is awareness itself. So all there is awareness. The human being is seen to be a modulation of awareness. The books, the tree, the chair is a modulation of awareness, which really means all there is awareness, and awareness is in different form. And even the form is known to be just illusory and apparent, that really the form is awareness. All there is awareness. So the oneness is where the experience is clearly seen to be made of awareness, contained within the field of awareness, and recognized by awareness itself. So all there is awareness. That means one, right? No separation. Even what we used to look at as separate objects are seen to not have a boundary. They are like objects in a painting. There can be 20 objects in a painting, but really we see there's not really 20 objects, there's just one painting. So then we look at the objects or the painting and we see there's no separation between the objects, because the bottle and the glass and the knife and the fork are not really separate objects. They are all contained within the one picture. So that's one version of oneness, that, or oneness sometimes refers to that. Another, and that doesn't mean that in our seeking that has to present itself, because people have different paths, different destinies, and some destinies don't include that shift in state. It's not what it's all about. That shift in state can be useful at breaking up some of the beliefs for some people that are destined to go through that path. In a more practical terms, because the state, someone will say it's a state, it's very practical, it's not conceptual. It's because it's experiential, because it's a state, because it's felt to be what I know myself as in that moment is awareness, and all there is awareness. So someone would say that's very practical. It's completely not, it's not at all conceptual. It's completely experiential. Now, that's not what I mean by practical. A state isn't necessarily the same as practical. A state is experiential as opposed to conceptual. And so I admit, if someone says, you know, this oneness is not a conceptual oneness, it's an experiential oneness, I agree. It's not really what it's all about. That's just part of a process for some people. Another form of oneness is when the psychological separation falls away. And when the psychological separation falls away, the experience is not of oneness. The experience is still of duality, where the experience is I am the body, aware of the book, and aware of the other person. If our belief in personal doership starts getting weaker and weaker and weaker, what we start to have is of being connected or being lived by life. The boundaries, the psychological boundaries, which are put in place when we believe I make myself talk, I make myself think, I make myself feel. What that means is we have an idea of ourselves as separate from life. We are the entity that is independent and uninfluenced by life. So we have this psychological image of ourselves as separate. And then the other is separate. And we then look back and criticize our separate self for not having, performed so well, and we blame the other separate self. And so there is a psychological separation which manifests in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, all based on a separate self. As we investigate and start to see that my thought arose because of something that happened just before, and the thought was an automatic movement because of what came before, which must be connected to the thought. And then we start realizing I'm not separate from life. I am in life, connected to the events and the circumstances, and am one with them because of the senses, and I can see that all of life that is happening through me is spontaneously happening through me, and there is no one doing it. There is no entity that is a separate doer. Now, that means the dissolving of the psychological separate self.
Yes.
And the attitude now is, well, the speaking is happening, the listening is happening, the hunger is happening, the tiredness is happening, the anger is happening, the laughter is happening. The other is being lived also. They are late because it's a happening. They are making noise because it's a happening. And so now the psychological separation has fallen away, and what we see is a dance of life. And it doesn't equate to the same experiential oneness that can present in that shift of state. What it is the falling away of our sense of who we are. Now, it can sound like that's very conceptual, like it sounds like, oh, you have a concept that everything is happening because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so now you just have a concept of oneness because your concept says you are theoretically connected to life. But someone would say, experientially, do you feel connected to life? Do you feel connected to the tree? And the answer would be, well, no, on some experiential level, on the physical, on the surface experience level, no, I don't feel connected to the tree. I feel separate from the tree, and like the tree is not what I am. But why would I say that the oneness is not just conceptual? And the reason is because the opposite concept, the concept that I am a separate doer, is so powerful that it really creates a sense of separation on a deep level. So we feel separate in experience when we believe we're the doer, both separate on the level of the tree and separate on a deeper level. And as the system, as the process starts to work on the non-doership and work on the belief of doership, and we start to see how this belief of doership is holding in place a false doer that doesn't exist. As that dissolves, it is the dissolving of a belief, which is really at its core a concept. It is dissolving of a belief. And so someone will say, well, so that's conceptual because you're dissolving a concept. And say, no, what's actually left is the absence of the separating concept. And so the oneness that is felt is not conceptual. It's not a oneness with the tree. It's not even a oneness that you could say is a feeling of oneness per se, but what it is it's the absence of the knowing oneself as separate that leads to a loneliness in life, leads to a feeling vulnerable, a feeling of separation that leads to seeing the other as the enemy, as a competitor, as a rival, leads to the blame, leads to the shame. So the oneness is felt in a different way, where we feel like all of those have fallen away. And so it isn't what people imagine, where it's conceptual. They would say, oh, it's just a belief that you are one with life. I say, well, it's the falling away of a feeling of separateness. Now, does that create a feeling of oneness? What it creates is a connection, a sense of being connected, but not in the way that we imagine. Our imagination is going to get it wrong. So that's another form of oneness, where it is the absence of the psychological separation. So that falls away. And a third form of oneness is where you can look at the causality of life, where one thing leads to the next, a bit like this notion of the butterfly effect, where, they say if a butterfly flaps its wings on one side of the globe, it can cause, a big storm on the other side of the globe. And that implies oneness, because everything is like dominoes. And if there were two, then there would be a gap and the sequence would stop at that gap. And a version of that is in quantum physics, where they talk about entanglement theory. You change something here and it changes something that seems to be somewhere else. But clearly, if you can change something here and it changes something there, they're not separate. So there are all these different onenesses, and very often in spiritual seeking, when the oneness of awareness sets in, that seems to be the most special, let's say. It seems to be the most experiential and the most real. And we can become convinced, that's the oneness. That's the one I want. And I'll tell you that I would go for the one that leads to the end of suffering. And some, in that other oneness, there are times when suffering falls away. But what those that know that oneness state I'm talking about, where everything is seen to be arising in awareness and they know themselves as awareness, that phase of the process is often very much linked with a lot of flip-flopping. And the flip-flopping is often overlooked, or it's seen by the person in oneness is that, I've come out of oneness and gone into the flop. And when the flip is there, I'm back in oneness again. And so the problem is that the oneness is not consistent, and I just need to wait till it's always oneness, and never going into flop. And so when that's the conclusion in someone's head, then they think, I don't need to worry about the flop or question the flop, because one day there will be no flop and all oneness. Whereas my suggestion here is that maybe the state of oneness is very synonymous with the flop or the flip-flopping, and that your idea that one day it will be just a continuous state of oneness and no flop is an expectation and an idea or a belief of what liberation is, that is not really what liberation is. And so waiting for this oneness and assuming, oh, I don't need to consider that oneness is not enlightenment, but that oneness is part of a phase of seeking, like the oneness state. I don't need to consider that because I assume one day it'll just be oneness and no falling out into the flop. My suggestion is that the integrated liberation, that which can remain continuous and unbroken, is not this knowing yourself as awareness in which everything arises state. My standpoint is that state is part of the process towards integrated liberation, where the oneness becomes seen much more as the end of the psychological separation. And then you happily let go of the oneness that's a state.
Okay, I hope that takes place in me. Thank you, Roger. I will rewind all this.
Yes.
And really thank you, because I sometimes I may be a little heavy on my seeking, but thank you for your answer. There's always a point where it seems I'm making a step forward. So thank you, really. And
I think people like your questions. So that's all.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay, so that's fine. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
See you another time. Goodbye.
Yes. See you, Isabel. Bye. Hi, Ranko.
Hello, Roger. Do you hear me?
Hi. Yes, very well.
Okay, we are talking first time.
Yes.
I'm glad that I come through. I have questions about yesterday's satsangs, about reincarnation.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Question is, does our shift in consciousness subconsciously influence other people indirectly? Because I see it very much in my experience.
Right. Can you repeat the question?
Okay. Our shift in consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does it influence other people?
It's just the internet's not very good. Did you say how does the shift in consciousness or our shift in consciousness?
Shift in consciousness.
Okay, a shift in consciousness. Does it influence other people?
Other people, yes.
Can you mute yourself a little bit? Because the sound is a little strange.
This is best I can do.
Yeah, or maybe put my sound down. Okay, well, I'll see how we go. Yeah, as things change inside of us, especially as the belief structures fall away, I think our energy changes, and we get to feel it internally. We feel a change in the density. The certain structures of doership and attachment to outcome are quite heavy and dense, and there's not much space in them. There's a lot of involvement and a lot of things going on. So it just feels very contracted and dense. And as those systems start to collapse and the structures change, we find more relaxation, we find more space, we find more awareness, more distance from the thoughts. And that's why it's referred to as spacious, as silent, as still. And there's a different frequency to our system when those doership and attachment beliefs fall away. So we get to have the benefit of the shift ourself internally. But because we're energetic entities in an energetic world, if our structure has changed, then there's going to be an influence on others without us even intending it. And just the same influence that everything has on everything else. There's always an influence of some sort. And I think that if our structure is resonating or moving at a different frequency, then that frequency has the capacity to bring other frequencies more in line with it, like a tuning fork. You know, you have two tuning forks, and the stronger frequency will bring the other frequency in resonance with it. And also, if it's not just energetic, it's based on your attitude, the way you interact with people. They can feel a change, they can see a change. You might actually start being an example for people without even intending to be an example. So I think there are different ways in which we have an influence on people without really intending that to be the case. And of course, this isn't an absolute thing, because you know, if someone has a very strong structure, even if you willingly want to try and make a difference, you are not necessarily going to be in control of the outcome.
Okay, do you hear me better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. Yes, that is the answer I was looking for, because lots of this happens in my experience. I influence some people, they start to behave like me. It's incredible. In this very short time, when I'm listening to your satsangs, lots of changes happens with me, and it has some influence.
Right.
It's magic.
That's very nice to hear. Sometimes it can cause problems. So sometimes the effect,
yes, hostility, even hostility.
Yeah, it can do that as well. I remember Ramesh used to often ask, let's say, a seeker who was had experienced big change, and Ramesh could sometimes see it, and he'd say, "Do your friends or family say that they have noticed a change?" So that's a question that he would ask, because he expected it often to be something that someone says, "Yes, actually, that maybe you know, they can't put their finger on it, but they can tell that something is different." So it makes sense that he would ask that question, because there is going to be a noticeable difference.
Yes, and I also, one more thing, lots of times I have a question for you, and let's say I have no courage to make that question, and next day you answer it, or a few days later. That happens a lot.
Yeah. This is nice.
I think it's the same thing.
The same thing because
same
of
thing, influencing people.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Like
It's nice
we
to
are
see
all
that,
connected.
like,
In some way, we are all connected in some intelligence, and these things happen.
yes, I wouldn't disagree with that. You never know if someone is thinking about a question on the other side of the world, it may well appear as a topic in my head that I start thinking about,
Yes.
and then talk about it in satsang. And I don't know where that thought came from, and we don't really understand the the cosmic laws. And so it may well be that that thought arises in my head because someone in the Sangha or someone listening to the satsangs is during the day thinking about a question, and the topic pops up in my head. Who knows? It could very well be that.
Yes, I agree. Thank you for your answer, and thank you for the satsang. It means lots to me.
Thank you, Ranko. Nice of you to drop in.
Thank you.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, good day, good evening to you.
Thank you. To you.
Thank you. I also was inspired with yesterday and had desire to continue an aspect of that which lit up for me. In a phrase, we could use the word wave of evolution. And I used to play with thoughts of how would you say it? I think there's this phrase, something like phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny, often pointing to something physical. I might have said that backwards. Evolutionary pattern. We study the physical and say that this derives from this, derives from this. And I've often been far more fascinated by what I thought of as the evolution of consciousness. Or perhaps you could say the evolution of the conscious mind, so to speak. And as I'm going to try to say this, I need some leeway, because I can tend to talk from maybe different points of reference that can shift at least between two different perspectives, and it might be, I might not get it out altogether, actually.
I'll see if hopefully I can fill in I'm sure I'll get what you mean. Yeah.
And unfortunately, I still don't know a question here, but I've been, it's said in self-realization circles, no one else can realize for you. We might also say no one can realize a life of unbroken happiness for me. No one else can realize a life of unbroken happiness for me. And I find that type of phrase, never said to be a pointer, I find it a most interesting pointer when I contemplate it. So the part about wave of evolution, I have been reading and looking and considering certain historical shifts in the world and thinking of them in terms of, so to speak, an evolution of consciousness. And in particular, the American Revolution and the writing of those individuals, and I guess in particular, the Declaration of Independence as written by Thomas Jefferson. And as that in particular had me rereading again recently when I heard that an American legislator said that it was a lie, that the Declaration of Independence was a lie, and specifically pointed to that part which says all men are created equal. And I think the reason for that pointing at this time was an issue of a challenge to discrimination and racial attitudes. But as I read over that particular document, the part that I'm trying to get to in bringing this up was how through my schooling, I always, looked at that document, read that document linearly, read the words, as words. But when I tried to look at it recently, I had a feeling as if it was really offering me an opening of that evolution of consciousness as put to paper at that time by that particular individual, if not the group who were working on it. And then I went back to this particular sentence, which I've heard more than one person discuss how that sentence seems odd given what's happened, that all men are created equal. But there's a sentence prior to that, or no, the beginning of that sentence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident. And perhaps a key there is in the meaning of the word self-evident. And as you connect that with my earlier concept, context of, no one else can realize that for you. And I just felt as I was reading this, that I was reading a wisdom teaching, a sage teaching, that we hold the truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and without elaborating on what those phrases mean to me, I presume we can consider how they're good pointers in and of themselves. Goes on to say, endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. The word creator is capitalized, the word rights is capitalized, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when I got that far, I'm going back and thinking about the human being able to realize a life of unbroken happiness.
Indeed, yes.
And I was just, I can't put out a whole thing here, just that I just felt on some level you could kind of see, even in that moment and through today and wherever, not that we have to take it linearly as that which happens in time. And here's where the flip-flop comes for me, is perhaps more importantly, what the documents were trying to point out was that this revolution is of people. Maybe governments, this government's being formed just to help that evolution of consciousness come about. So where I thought that the American Revolution was in large part gaining freedom from England, so to speak, it also felt like it was a movement, an evolutionary wave, a movement of consciousness. So I guess if I had to draw a question from that, maybe I could ask if that's a thought that's ever passed your mind, and if it has not, what happens as it passes now?
It very much is a thought that a contemplation that's been had by myself, which has related to the Constitution in exactly the way you described it, as a piece of wisdom writing. That's a sense from having limited exposure to it, but with an interest to look into it a little bit more than the very limited exposure that I started off with. But I still can't say that I am an expert at the people, knowing the people that put it together. But my sense when I've engaged in it and the thinking around it was, this is one of the wisdom documents of the world, that this is going beyond human beings putting in place agendas. If anything, it is putting in guidelines that prevent agendas from being established. And especially the part that says we have the right for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I see that what they've prioritized in the bits that I have read and is very much what comes out of a non-attachment to outcomes. When someone realizes their happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, then the need to control others, the need for others to not have rights falls away. And I think that, the revolution and the people behind it, not necessarily all of them, but some of the key figures, were very much functioning based on insight of having to deal with oppressors. and therefore, I guess, understanding that you can't to fight that with in kind means you just end up in the same position where you will at some point be an oppressor. So I think that they put together the Constitution by realizing what oppression attitude is, and then stepping out of it and laying down foundations that tries to avoid that from kicking in down the track. Now, that doesn't mean that government has continued with that attitude in it. I think government by default collapses back into agendas, because the human design at this point in time is still very much governed by doership and attachment to outcomes. But the foundation is there to, to me, it will be a foundation that when that set of agendas falls away, that document will hold water. So I tend to think we are in agreement.
Well, then maybe to tie it also to today's talk. Well, while you were talking, I had the connection it had to do with maybe earlier your reference, your use of the words flip-flop, and what you were explaining during that question answer of well, even prior to that, when you were talking about the dropping away and what that process can look like. That in the story of that revolutionary period, that's exemplified. That the story is of oppression by the thinking mind, if you will, and what happens when you wake to that. So yeah, I was just thinking, yeah, well, that also just is a story that bears out what you were talking about today. Just adding one other thought, I was taught that when one of the original drafts that was done on the Declaration of Independence, it got to the part of among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of, that it was drawn up, and there was a debate going on, that the next word was going to be property. That among these rights are the life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Now, I can't guarantee you that's true now. I'm pulling from a 40-year-old memory. I just remember that discussion going on, and in light of our talks here, find it interesting that the overwhelming take was to say happiness rather than property. Not that those two can't have to be taken as different, but that's all. That's the end of that sentence. But I guess what I'm particularly caught up with and have my attention on a lot is what I might call the wave of evolution. The wave of evolution, as you were discussing yesterday, lifted me up from my chair. If you're moved in that direction again, I'm game.
Right. Okay. I'll add some things in relation to evolution of consciousness, because there can be confusions when we look at the word consciousness in certain ways, where someone might say, well, but consciousness doesn't actually evolve, and there's merit in taking that stance. So it's very much about the context in which the word consciousness is being used, because consciousness can be referred to as the awareness which is always present and aware, and consciousness itself doesn't think. Consciousness doesn't change. Consciousness is not the body, but rather that which functions through the instrument and is aware of life and aware of all of the events. And so in a way we can say that consciousness doesn't evolve, but rather our thinking mind evolves, which really just means a dissolution of the thinking mind, or our intellect evolves, which is a dissolution of the thinking mind. And as a result of that, our experience changes from suffering to peace of mind or happiness. And it's the same consciousness that is aware of the peace of mind as was forced to be aware of the suffering, which was just the thinking mind. And because there was suffering, what consciousness was aware of was known as an uncomfortableness of oneself. And when that thinking mind dissolves, consciousness is then aware of life without that object in there. So that's describing how, in a way, consciousness itself, when referred to as awareness or beingness, that which is aware of life, doesn't really evolve. However, there is a lot of merit in talking about an evolution of consciousness when we can describe consciousness as something different, and maybe introducing the notion of conscience can help illustrate what we mean by an evolution of consciousness when it is being spoken of in a different context to pointing out consciousness as awareness. So when we look at the human being as an integrated entity, meaning a human being that is not separated into awareness and the body, which is really a conceptual distinction that helps deconstruct or allows us to see the human being more clearly, or the layers of the human being more clearly. But once that's happened, it needs to get concertinaed back in so that it exists as a singular entity. And so because the consciousness and the body and the intellect, so mind, body, and spirit, you could say, are three but not three, like the Trinity, three but one, we can say that while the human being has the active thinking mind, which at its root has doership and attachment to outcome, and attachment to outcome is very responsible for all of the wars and the attacking and the trying to get more and the seeing anyone who is different as, not being the same, because we're not connected to essence, we're connected to just the external and form. And so one tribe is different to this tribe, and we tend to go and have wars with the other tribe. So that doership and attachment and the thinking mind is very responsible for cruelty, fighting, attack, defense, gaining more at the cost of the other. And if we look back in history, I think we can say that humans were less conscious, and obviously using that word conscious, not in the form of awareness, because humans were always aware. It's just that, awareness was forced to be aware of a different system, which was much more interested in survival. And so humans tended to be more cruel, I think, in history. And not to say that we're anywhere near perfect at the moment, but I think there are these principles that come in with thinking. They come in as there is an evolution of our thinking, which happens in time. It happens as other systems progress, as industrial revolutions and technological revolutions happen, that mean we can survive more easily than we did in the past. There are thinkers that come in and add perspectives from different points of view, the appreciation of art may at some point not have been there, and then people come in and say, you know, art is a key expression of humanity that needs to head in the direction of just, you know, money, for example, and development at all costs. So I think humanity with its intellect, as the intellect starts focusing on areas that are not just doership and attachment to outcome, there is what happens is what we can call an evolution of consciousness, which really means more conscience, human beings becoming more conscience filled, more focused on things that can start having a priority in life. Now, I don't know that this would have been, you know, if we say, well, wouldn't it be great if the cavemen had this increased consciousness or conscience? I don't know whether that would be realistic to even think it as being a possibility, because back then, the circumstance might not have supported it. And so when we go back 1,000 years, and you know, there's just cruelty, and there still is, you know, we're still doing things like torturing people. Now, it's not legal because there are human rights and there are organizations that are there to try and enforce human rights. And yet the doership and attachment is still strong enough that there are individuals that will try and get around the fact and torture people and do things that at some point in the future will be unconscionable. And they're already unconscionable in principle, because the human rights bodies are there that say it's unconscionable to do these things. So there's a movement towards that. So that's my thought on the evolution of consciousness, is that human beings, as everything develops, as we become more capable of surviving without having to worry about looking over our shoulders for dinosaurs or tigers, or, you know, there are systems that can now support more and more humanity surviving without having to work as hard as we would have had to historically. At some point, humans are going to think, you know, how can individuals own $150 billion? Of what point is it for an individual to have $150 billion? It doesn't make any difference to them whether they have 150 or $5 billion. And so at some point, it will be unconscionable for that use of resources to be allocated that way. But it will take time for all of that to be permissible and for those changes to come in a way that is orderly. And I think it will happen. So that's my little bit on the evolution of humanity.
I appreciate that expansion. You used a phrase, a human being that is integrated. Mm-hmm. And I may not have clearly heard where you went with it, because my mind went maybe different, and that is that experience of being an integrated human being as being very attuned to the collective mind, as if the collective mind is that through which I am seen, which is something that has had some experience. I've had some experience, particularly when I was, so to speak, empathetically experiencing suffering. And for some reason, and sort of instantly realized that that wasn't my suffering, so to speak. That I was absorbing something, and in that instant, that dropped. So I appreciated also your comment that then you come back, you know, concentrate perhaps back into to living in the body, mind, organism in which you're experiencing life. And then came another thought relative to that, in that there is some value in appreciating or considering evolution of consciousness. In that, for me at least, whenever I've had the feeling of what's the point, I've studied so much of teachings, world teachings, you know, from Plato, so much of that, and now and then it's like, so what's the point? I mean, it just amounts to the next moment, so what? But, or this moment, forget the next. But from a standpoint of an evolution of consciousness, not that I'm so thinking I have control on that, but just in appreciating the movement, there's a value in, as the last caller pointed out, that existence as an integrated human being. That it's not, that there's that confusion, that consciousness. Yeah, I can't even finish the sentence. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I don't know that I would talk about, when I talk about evolution, I just talk about it as something that is happening. We see it in hindsight. If we look in hindsight, we see a movement. I don't think it's something that we need to be invested in. And I definitely wouldn't look at it as being reason, because I think our peace of mind is based on not needing a reason. Because peace of mind to me stems from an appreciation of life as it is now. And even if one was living 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, when, let's say, theoretically, human consciousness was less evolved, and we could imagine some time in the future where consciousness was more evolved, as we probably can looking into the future from where we are now, that should, someone living 1,500 years ago, if they had the understanding, there should be no reason for them to not have been happy back then. And so any idea of the evolution of consciousness is essentially, well, that will be what life will be then, and someone can be happy with that, just like someone can be happy with life as it is now. So I think while talking about how humanity is moving towards, or there is an evolution towards something, but I don't think that future outcome is something that we should use as a sense of this is the purpose. I think that the notion that there is no purpose is very accurate when it comes to happiness for the human being. It's like, my purpose is to do in this moment whatever I feel like doing. And life is lived for that purpose, for the purpose of being whatever I'm being in this moment. But I think we should probably, I'll take one more call.
Thank you.
But as always, Mark, it's a pleasure chatting with you. And
thank you.
Feel free to drop in anytime.
You're too kind.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Roger.
Hello, hello.
I just want to say thank you for doing this. It's quite extraordinary that that you're doing this when, you know, there's so much uncaring in the world. Let's put it that way at the moment. And for someone to do what you're doing is quite extraordinary. Just thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. That's nice of you to say.
I've been listening to your YouTube videos for a couple of years now, and I've been on some sort of journey for the last 10 years when my entire life circumstances changed. I was married for 32 years, and my now ex-wife said she wanted to split, and we had what I thought was a perfect life. Obviously she didn't. You know, we had everything, and everything fell apart. Like everything left my life, apart from my sons, and I've got 3 little granddaughters now. But I'm really interested in your teacher Ramesh, what he said, that people can only ever act from their genetic makeup and their up-to-date conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first heard you say that, I thought, what's he on about? And now I understand completely. I completely understand that what other people do and say, it's all they can ever do.
Mm-hmm.
That you think, oh, they shouldn't have said that, they shouldn't have done that. And that is really interesting, the way you sort of interpolated that if people do and say things that aren't to my preference, then it's an attack on me. And so I just didn't realize that until I started listening to you. I don't know what I'm saying, really. But the question I'm asking, what's happened is I've been surrounded by people all my life. I was what I describe as a people person. And I had high-powered jobs and lots of responsibilities and a local politician and all sorts of things. And then it suddenly all left my life. And it's just me on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And it's uncomfortable. Really, really uncomfortable. But today you said something, the question, because it should always be a question, is you were talking about, I need you to be there, and I need you to be there, and I need you to be there in order for me to feel comfortable. I just wondered if you could expand on that a bit. I've never heard anybody say that before.
Well, let's see. I guess what I was getting at is that when our sense of self is a particular way, and I'm really talking about the sense of self that is the psychological self that has an idea about what it needs in life, will even, crave painful things in a way. Like if someone identifies as a victim, they almost are thankful when someone victimizes them. Because at least they know, yes, thank you for confirming that I am what I think I am. So there's this strange irony that we will tend to ask for what matches our structure. And so if our structure feels like it needs debate, that it needs confrontation, that it needs affirmation, that it needs appreciation, it's going to set those things up. It's going to feel uncomfortable if they're not there. And it's in a way, it's going to set up a life that has those things, like pressure in the room. And often those relationships and those ways of engaging in life are reinforcing that psychological sense of self that is what prevents us from being free of the effect of that psychological self. And so it takes us to realize that is what's happening, is that we are on one level feeling comfortable by having these things in our life, and on another level, those things in our life are making us very uncomfortable. On a deeper level, they're keeping us disconnected. So they create a sense of comfort to the false sense of self, but the false and strengthen it. And yet the false sense of self is what is really keeping us disconnected from our true self, which is where our real comfortableness is going to come from. So I guess an example could be where you say, you know, being on my own is really uncomfortable. It may be because your sense of self has included in it these connections. And now that's something that in this instance, you're not necessarily able to control. And so there's an uncomfortableness with them not being there. But it may be a blessing. It may be life breaking certain habits that will feel uncomfortable when they're broken, and yet may lead to a deeper comfortableness if the circumstance aids the seeking, let's say, and the identity continues to collapse or falls away.
That all makes eminent sense. In fact, something you said today about you gave an example of the woman or the girl who didn't want to have children, for other people to think that she was incomplete person to feel that way. And it sort of resonated with me because my ex-wife, one day, we were married for about 4 years, and I said, perhaps we should have some children now. She said, I don't want children. She eventually did have 2 children. We had 2 very fine sons. But again, 6 years apart. But it just seemed to me, I now realise she had the children so she could stay with me, perhaps. And then when the children had grown up and they no longer needed her, she no longer needed to be with me. But I can see all the things you're saying, that everything is just, life is just living us. It's just our destiny. We can't control these things. It's all out of our control. And, I'm just really, it's quite extraordinary when someone like you points this out. Do you think, yeah? Because my teacher said, he was an academic, he just says, look, Martin, none of this matters. Whatever happened, none of it matters. And I think on a sort of a thinking mind level, it doesn't matter, but the body remembers. This is I don't know if you're aware of sort of this body work theories that get the body remembers. So like for me, my identical twin brother died. I remember him dying, and it was stuck in my body. It was never processed until I was over 50. So it's quite, just everything you say, I just find it very, very interesting, Roger. Like you were saying about cavemen and their consciousness, and what they were more concerned with was survival. And I think what's happened now in the 21st century, that we're still conditioned to survive. We've got this nervous system, these senses, which are endless in my opinion and experience, to survive as an organism. And now we find ourselves in the 21st century where like you quite rightly point out, you can control enormous amounts of resources and not have to do anything to survive. But our nervous systems are just conditioned to survival. And this is why a lot of people find themselves in a state of discomfort or being uncomfortable, as you say. And it's quite, there's no realization of this. And I know you live in Australia, but we've got a government in this country now who are just, they're insane. They think that they can control everybody, this huge social experiment where they've taken all our human rights pretty much away from us. And I was put under house arrest. It's the people just, they think they can control a thing called a virus, you know, and in trying to control the virus, this social experiment, they remove people's enjoyment of life, their basic human rights to enjoy their life. It's quite extraordinary. We're living in really extraordinary times.
We are, I mean, attitudinally, if we can see that, you know, life is always going to have, and humans are always going, we're always going to be able to find imperfection. Life is actually never going to be perfection relative to our preferences. So whenever we see these situations, even if they're injustices or we think they're injustices, then attitudinally it's like, well, this is life, you know, life is a work in progress. And our idea that, you know, government is going to get it right, or that business is going to be ethical and nothing else, they tend to be idealism. So if we can look at life in each moment and say, oh, it's perfect, as in not perfect, all ideal, but it's unfolding exactly as life is meant to unfold, meaning imperfect. So this is where the saying perfectly imperfect or imperfectly perfect comes from, to say that the imperfection of life, which is, when I mean imperfection, it means that the pleasure and the pain, the duality of life, is perfect. Which another way of saying it is that the whole is made up of duality, pleasure and pain, good and bad, and that is the whole, and it's never going to be anything different. So attitudinally, if we wake up and we open the door and go, oh yeah, government taking our liberties away, makes sense.
Yes.
If we take an attitude of resisting that, and essentially we're saying, no, life should be a particular way, and that should be a particular way, creates resistance. So when you look at your situation, which is sad, there's going to be emotional or biological sadness, a form of emotional pain. So there's no diminishing that, but can you attitudinally look at it as, aha, so this is Martin's story, Martin's destiny. I don't mean your psychological story, but you know, the sequencing of events. And attitudinally, it's like, yes, this is Martin's story unfolding. That tends to mean more acceptance, more peace of mind.
Yeah, I get this peace of mind thing. I do have it very often, and then, you know, the thinking mind takes over and start making up all these stories and concepts and anxiety of, oh God, this could, you know, this shouldn't be like this, and to realize it, just think, oh, what are you doing? A bit like picking your nose. Do you know what I mean? You find yourself picking your nose, and well, you should, you know, stop it. It's not helping. Perhaps it's not a very good analogy, but thanks, Roger.
Yeah.
The one thing I like about you, and I'm sort of trying to, is your authenticity. The last 10 years, I've come across so many teachers. I've been halfway around the world twice, lots of the Far East, and I found this authenticity in there. But so many people pretend. You know, they're pretending. You know, you just don't pretend anything. You just say, this is who I am and this is how it is. And it's so refreshing. Just to...
You wait till you see me getting irritable.
Well, yeah, but if you got irritable, I just think, oh, well, Roger's getting irritable. He's a human being. You know, no one's perfect. But just to say, you know, actually, fuck it. This is how it is. And to want it to be any other way is ridiculous. You were
Yeah,
so lucky to find Ramesh, weren't you? Well, not lucky, but as part of your destiny. He must have
well,
been terrific.
I do say it's luck from one perspective, given I wasn't in control of it.
No.
Then yeah, I was lucky very much, because I often see, this is why I take this perspective. I often see that 20 years is nothing to get stuck in seeking more and more nothingness, or more and more not being a person. It's so easy when certain glimpses show up to think it's about going deeper and deeper into that. And after 3 or 4 years of exploring that and thinking it was about going deeper into that, luckily I came across Ramesh, who said, okay, now that's sorted.
Yeah.
Now let's get back to the task of happiness in daily living. So I'm very pleased to keep sharing the pointers. So thanks for dropping in, and thanks for your kind words.
Thank you,
and
Rod.
We'll do it all again tomorrow.
Great. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.